Hello in your homes. Hi, everybody, and welcome. I'm Dorothea von Moltke, and I'm one of the owners of Labyrinth Books. Welcome, one and all, to what is our final event of the spring event season, and we're going out on a high note. We are in the midst of preparing the fall season. I don't know yet if that's going to be in person or online. I'm expecting at least some things to be in person, and I just can't wait to welcome many of you back into our underground event space at the store. So if the enthusiasm, with which discussants respond to an invitation to participate in a book talk like tonight's talk is any indication of that author's standing in the field, well, then Daniel Padilla Peralta is kind of a rock star in classics. He is joined tonight by Hannah Chulik-Baird and Liv Yarrow, both of whom did the sort of email equivalent of jumping out of their seats when I asked them if they would be part of this conversation. A conversation about Daniel's recent book, Divine Institutions, Religions and Community in the Middle Roman Republic. I'm going to hold it up. It's a Princeton University Press book. Our wonderful friends at Princeton Press have made another great book. And so I'm grateful to Hannah and Liv for their enthusiasm and for their time. Before I introduce our guests, though, I have a couple of brief notes. First, a thank you to the Classics Department and the Humanities Council at Princeton for co-sponsoring this event and helping us to get word out to all of you. And for those of you who are new to this streaming platform, I just want to point out where you can put your questions if you have them. So while we're going to keep the chat up during the event, that's not where we want you to put the questions. Instead, please find there's an Ask a Question button at the bottom of your screen. So please find that, click on it, and queue up your questions right there as they come to you. It's actually helpful for us if you put them in there as you think of them, because it gives us sort of a sense of how much time to leave for the Q&A. So don't be shy. And then also at the bottom of your screen, but right above the Ask a Question button is a long button. You can click on that to order a copy of Divine Institutions, and just enter Peralta at checkout for 10% off on your order. You can choose to have that sent to you or to come by the store to pick it up curbside, whichever way you prefer. And now on to our guests. Many of you will know Daniel Padilla Peralta as a professor of classics at Princeton University, where he's also affiliated with the program in Latino studies. His interests both within classics and beyond are varied, many, and wide-ranging. But as he himself writes, and as is very clear in his new book too, and here I'm going to quote him, "The common thread is an enduring concern with patterns of cultural and intellectual exchange, an interest in new approaches that can better illuminate those patterns, and an ecumenical attitude to the many different kinds of evidence available to us." Readers of the New York Times will have seen the recent profile of Daniel in the Papers magazine, which made very clear that he is someone who is willing to make some noise, as well as being willing to do the hard work of scholarship to make apparent the role that the field of classics has played in Western constructions of whiteness and in the defense of those constructions. He has also given us a record of his own journey with the subtitle of his previous book, Undocumented, A Homeless Shelter to the Ivy League. And I urge you to read this remarkable story if you haven't done that already. As I said earlier, I really am very happy that two of Daniel's colleagues in classics are also with us. Hannah Chulik-Baird is assistant professor of classical studies at Boston University, where her work centers on Roman intellectual life. She is active across all media, from podcasts to Twitter to the Classics and Social Justice blog, which she runs. And her recent publications include Stoicism in the Stars, Cicero's Aratea in the De Natura Deorum, and Staging Roman Slavery in the 2nd century BCE. Last but in no way least, Liv Yarrow. She has a couple of appointments in the CUNY system as professor in classics at Brooklyn College and in classics and history at the Graduate Center. And her books include Historiography at the End of the Republic, Provincial Perspectives on Roman Rule, and The Republic to 49 BCE, Using Coins as Sources. I now look forward very much to getting to listen together with all of you to a conversation among our panelists about divine institutions. It's a book that challenges us in a formulation on method that I find really compelling, and I'm going to quote it. This is Donnell writing, "To defamiliarize the generally recognized components of mid-Republican religion and the conceptual and pragmatic binding agents that held it together. Donnell has many tricks up his sleeve for accomplishing this defamiliarization, not least that of making the material record speak in new ways. And at stake is the role of communal religious activity in engendering trust and also compliance in a period of state formation." So let me now get out of the way so that our guests can get on with it. And I'm going to first bring up Donnell. Let's see. Hi, Donnell. Good to have you. Welcome. And next comes, let me see, Hannah. Good to have you, Hannah. And now another click. I leave. Welcome, all of you. It's great that you're here. And I'm going to duck out.
Great. Thank you, Dorothea.
Thank you. It was a wonderful introduction.
Hi, Donnell.
Hi. This is so exciting.
Yay. Okay, well, let's jump right in. So first of all, congratulations on a excellent, beautiful book. Yeah. Which the cover is absolutely gorgeous. I think that's worth celebrating as well as the contents. So let's start with a question which should be easy, but maybe it's not. But basically, why this book? How did this book come into being? What's your path? What led you here to write in the way that you did?
So the book was in some ways a bit overdetermined. Early on in my graduate training, I was doing tutorials on Roman religion with Martin Goodman at Oxford. And he set a question for one of my tutorial papers. Why did Greeks, Romans, and Jews build temples? And I dashed off this tutorial paper that was a rush job, to say the least, and that did not represent the most considered thinking. But as I began to reflect during the tutorial itself and after on the question, it occurred to me that there was a real opportunity to braid together two emergent interests of mine at the time. The first was my interest in Roman history, and specifically the history of the Roman Republic and the Middle Republic, most prominently. I was drawn to Middle Republic because there are source problems that bedevil any work on the Middle Republic, especially the Middle Republic of the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE. But I also wanted to engage in some scrutiny of my own formation as a person for whom religion and religious practice have been absolutely central. I grew up in a very Catholic household. I spent a lot of time in church. And one of the consequences of that time spent indoors in church and in adjacency to churches over the years was a heightened awareness of the many kinds of activities that take place in and around built structures for ritual practice. And so it was with these motivations in mind that the project began to take shape. First, while I was completing a master's at Oxford, and then when I began my graduate studies at Stanford, where I did my PhD. At Stanford, I had the good fortune of being introduced to a range of methods in the social sciences that gave me some tools. But it was important for me that the tools not simply be, well, tools, but that they open up spaces for me to engage in conversation with folks in other fields who could, refine my thinking, but also become sort of meaningful partners in collaboration as we sought to, understand this many-headed phenomenon that is, religious practice and community building. For that, I have to shout out the Stanford Interdisciplinary Graduate Fellowship, which gave me money and time to really refine the scope of the project during its dissertation stage. But most of all, I have to thank the Columbia Society of Fellows, which provided me with a home and money while I was really working hard to make the project as interdisciplinary and as ranging in method and execution as possible. So that's how the book came together. It came together thanks to institutions that invested in me, and it came together thanks to people who are willing to give me the space and resources with which to fold in to the scope of my academic research interests and commitments that were very central to my own personal identity.
Thank you so much. I'm wondering, you've talked a little bit about your motivations, but one of the things that I really appreciated reading the book was the way in which you recenter religion as a motivation for action, rather than strictly economic or other formula. How do we write a history? I mean, you've done it, but I would love to hear you talk more about how we write history about religious motivation and how that looks different in our evidence from other types of motivations we might ascribe to human actions.
The cornerstone difference there between writing histories of religious practice and writing histories of other phenomena is that, as many folks far more learned than I have remarked, we operate in, especially the sort of Euro-Americas, in a quasi or robustly secularizing discourse in which the idea that the gods could be primary agents or that divinity could be a primary agent is actually like hard to accept in scholarship. I mean, folks can theorize this work, but and this is especially true for work on the late Republic. When it comes time to put your cards down, most folks will follow a line that has quite a Polybian pedigree to it. The gods are there, and the Romans obsess about them, partly because they serve this sort of quintessentially human function of opening up a space for the manipulation of others in the community. And what I have been trying to do in not just the book Divine Institutions, but also in other publications, is restore a sense of centrality to the experience of religious practice and the many ways in which, because of the scales at which it operates, because of the intersubjective aspects that it calls into being and relies upon, it manages to decenter human agency, even though at the end of the day, we are still talking about human actors doing human things, right? So this is a dilemma that's not easy to straighten out. I have been doing a lot of thinking recently with the writing of Lindsay Deirdre Murphy, whose book on Roman Republican augury has been very influential in my thinking. And one of the things that Lindsay does that I am in huge admiration of is show us that at the end of the day, Romans really did believe this business, that the gods were overwhelming figures, that they commanded respect, fear, terror, not simply as adjacent to or as collaborators in fundamentally human objectives, but in the service of objectives that were greater than human. And that is something that I've tried to work out in realizing within my own work why it is that this community comes around ritual practice and worship in the ways that it does.
That leads very well, I think, onto a question that I had, which was that you, throughout the book, talk about consensus, though not unity, which I think is an important distinction, but the idea of kind of congregation and consensus and maybe kind of balance, but buy-in, and you talk about a trust network. And this is kind of how the architecture of the book unfolds, is that you start with this kind of looking through the temple in these cross sections from senators on the one side, and then by the end of the book you get to these pilgrimages, right? And so you get the very elite construction from the vowing of the temple to the building of the temple, the marshalling all of these resources, to the people who actually use it, who are kind of invisible unless you pay attention to these anatomical depositions, these votive objects that people deposit. So basically, how do you put all of this together? I think this is kind of the thrust of what you wanted to say when you say you build bridges between otherwise isolated and artificially partitioned evidence. Do you feel like it all comes together? Or is there still more that you feel is somehow lacking in this? I mean, how do you build the consensus out of all of these different pieces of information?
Yeah, whether it comes all together is for my generous readers to determine. But no, I mean, I have been left with a great deal of doubt, even as I sort of commit myself to the sort of lines of interpretation of the book, as to whether the approaches on display in the book are adequate to the task of brokering sort of this sort of society-wide compact at the level of interpretation and at the level of reconstruction. Certainly, I think that one of the ways to test this would be to look at how the system deals with its internal tensions in the period after the period of interest to me. So, like, what's going on in the 2nd and 1st centuries BC? Like, how does the story continue beyond the Second Punic War? Would it be plausible to argue, for example, that it's really in the social war and in the civic eruptions of the 1st century BC that we see the disarticulation of this consensus? And if so, what does that say about the longevity, the durability of the religiously mediated forms of congregation that I had held out as coming into shape during the 4th and 3rd centuries? But another approach would be to see whether the reconstruction that I've set out in Divine Institutions has parallels in Mediterranean, Eurasian, and other global contexts that may be worth summoning here. And this is what I, in the later stages of the book, found myself wishing I had done more in the book's sort of inaugural incarnation. I am, and at the time of the writing of the book, was already drawn to comparative approaches for thinking through these questions, but then I decided that my book would double in length if I took that up seriously. One of the questions that I am left sorting through at the end of the day is whether it is, to revert again to Polybius, true that Roman practice is sort of fundamentally different from what we see elsewhere in the Mediterranean, and specifically, among those Greeks, those fellow Greeks whom Polybius disparages, or whether what we're seeing here is an intensification of something that has plenty of parallels, not just in Western Eurasia, but in other global contexts. For this, I think that the next port of call will be a study of other sort of axial age communities, although I use this phrase advisedly because there are problems with it. And I think that one of the most enticing possibilities to embrace is that when we talk about the interaction of religion and state formation, as I've tried to set it out in the book, what we are ideally doing is setting up a template by which we can engage in sort of future comparative study that really does sort of decenter the Western Eurasian experiment, and specifically the Roman experiment, in favor of other cultural sites for analyzing and testing the hypotheses at the heart of the book.
Up there, I just also moves on to another question I had, which is, as a literary scholar, one of the things that it's an old idea that we're moving away from, but it still casts a long shadow, which is that Roman consciousness was kind of bootstrapped through exposure to Greek culture. And I really felt as I was reading your book that this is one of your, maybe something that you want to fight against in some way, because it's really not true in the sense of that is not an adequate explanation for all of these phenomena that you have teased out. And instead of just seeing it as influence, you seem to be moving towards kind of confluence, because I see you demonstrating the mobility of people, traffic, exchange, pilgrimage, and you use the phrase of centrifugal and centripetal force, the idea of a lot of movement around, which is not captured by say, the literary record, but might be captured by other kinds of things. So am I right to guess that you have an anti-Hellenization bent to this, or is this just my bent that I'm reading into you?
Nah, you're totally right. That's there, and that's there plenty. I mean, partly because I feel that the Romans were always already Hellenized, right? Like there is no sort of real way, especially after John North Hopkins' book came out. But I mean, even before then, we could cite expositions of the evidence that made it quite clear that the notion that Rome somehow over the course of the 4th and 3rd centuries is dramatically reshaped by some kind of extrinsic Hellenization or some Hellenization that comes from the outside into the heart of Rome. This had already to be reconsidered. And I feel that, the book sometimes plays around the edges of this, but I mean, there are moments when I try to be more explicit about why I think that even the conceptual vehicle of Hellenization is inadequate. And I will just alert people to work in progress that Seth Bernard and I are cooking up on this idea, both in connection with a volume on the 4th century that Lisa Mignone and Seth Bernard and I are co-editing, to which Liv has made an expert and brilliant contribution, as well as a piece that Seth and I have been working on Middle Republican connectivities. But for me, the big problem, and one that I think requires a sort of a style of analysis that moves beyond the sort of Hellenization question, has to do with the sometimes sort of entrenched unwillingness or grudging willingness of folks working in the Eastern Mediterranean and in other parts of the Mediterranean to understand the model of the Greek polis as idealized in 20th and 21st century scholarship as one contingent experiment in state formation among many in the Mediterranean. All of these experiments are thoroughly inflected with religious practices and questions. Sometimes the scholarship on the Greek city-state tends to privilege this kind of institution building that is artificially severed from religion. And this is particularly true in the work of Greek historians whose writings I admire and who in several cases mentored me or sat on my dissertation committee. If we are to do better by the sort of complexities of Mediterranean history generally and Eurasian and global history more broadly, I think it's really central to think more critically about convergence and the conditions of convergence and confluence that you pointed out to in how you formulated the question, right? There are a lot of communities that are coming together in the course of processes that are fundamentally similar. And I think that when Ian Morris in the 2003 article wrote about Mediterraneanization, he put his finger right on the beating pulse of this. The Greek paradigm is a paradigm that is actually not really Greek at all. And to understand the Roman experiment is simply to be thrown into a vortex of ever-shifting political dispensations in the Mediterranean, all of which are in the same kind of like heady cultural, intercultural brew in the 4th and 3rd centuries.
So one of the things that I really liked about the book was how you used not just the interconnectivity within the Italic Peninsula between the many different sanctuary centers, but how you used the Hellenistic there's that word, but the Italic Hellenistic sanctuaries that we know so well, as comparative data points for Rome itself, which is sometimes much harder to grapple with than, say, a single excavated sanctuary site because of continuous occupation and site reuse through to the present in Rome. I'm wondering, we've scaled out to talk about how your book situates Rome within that Mediterranean series of models. Where does Rome fit within its Italic context, and where else in Italy did you find yourself spending the most time mentally as you were working on the book?
This is a question that's sort of been haunting me since the book came out, and it was haunting me after I submitted the final version of the manuscript, because on the one hand, I had sort of promised myself that I would not fall into the trap of Roman exceptionalism, and that I would really, really try hard not to do what I had sort of taken other people to task for, sort of lionizing Rome. And yet, here I was, finishing a book that privileged Rome as a central node in all of these, glacial and Italian relations. And yes, I, turn to other sites in Italy from time to time. And in the reconstruction of the networks that I discuss, especially in chapter 5, I try to accentuate the degree to which some of the phenomena that we see in Rome happen at Rome only because there are other sites in this sort of Italic orbit that are also contributing to the formation and dissemination of these practices. That Rome, in other words, is part of an ecology. But it is clear to me on a reread of the book, something that I try to avoid doing, that there is much more to be said for the co-implicatedness of other regions of Italy in the processes that I center in Rome itself. One of the benefits of the book, as I was working on it for my own sort of reorientation and scholarship, was that I became much better versed in developments in Etruria, and I became much more interested in the trajectory of Roman Etruscan cultural relations, as a consequence of which some of the writing that grew out of the book project, but that sort of then appeared in articles or continued to appear in articles, has been much more sort of insistently preoccupied with other aspects of the peninsula's cultural life, including those aspects that are legible as Etruscan, even if in some cases we're dealing with evidence for these Etruscan cultural practices that comes much later in date relative to my period of emphasis in the book. The last point I'll make in response to that question is that the other concern I had as the book was rounding into form was that it was not sufficiently grounded in the logics of what Nick Terranato has termed, the early Roman expansion. Now, I don't agree with many aspects of Nick's analysis, but what I appreciate about his book is that in one of the chapters, he really does work you through Rome's competition and what Rome's competition is getting up to. All these other emergent imperial formations that collide with Rome or that have ambitions or fantasies of growth only for their day in the sun to be cut short. And what became clear to me on reading Nick's treatment of this in the early Roman expansion is that, as I was saying earlier in response to Hannah's question, many communities in the Mediterranean are converging on a set of tools for what I describe as sort of state formation bootstrapping. Sometimes the reason they don't quite sort of get in terms of scale to where Rome is by the mid 3rd century has to do with good old sort of Polybian style tuche or its denunciations. Other times, though, there are structural factors, specific to practices of institution building, of consensus building, that we can locate as sort of creating hurdles and or as opening doors. And so there, at least, I feel that the book tried to sort of set out what some of these look like. But for the other side of the Italic dimension that came into sharper focus for me as the book was winding down, I will just have to refer folks to my work on epistemicide. Since there, I think I did find a vocabulary and a set of approaches that were really helpful in clarifying as I thought to underscore the textures of Rome's expansion across the peninsula and what that meant to all of these different communities that are trying to renegotiate their terms of engagement with Rome itself.
I want to follow up on your dialogue about Nick Tornato's work on Roman expansion, and you may or may not remember this toss-away footnote in your book, but I really latched onto it. You nodded towards the Great Migration, and you said that you wanted to talk about a Great Migration, that you were nodding towards both Walter Scheidl's work, but also towards U.S. The Great Migration in the history of the United States, and as you were just speaking now, I recalled to mind your use of the Great Migration, and I thought, how would you put these two things in dialogue? Is the Great Migration sort of a proto idea that you would set in competition with a Tornado model of Roman expansionism? And what do we get from thinking about the comparative evidence from the United States?
Yeah, this was, I did squirrel this idea away in a footnote. And I was, at the time, as you pointed out, thinking about both Walter Scheidl's use of the idea, but also what I saw as really exciting work done on the Great Migration and its social, economic, and political ramifications in the United States. What I was worried about was approaching some of these this work of comparison cavalierly, and squirreling it away in a footnote is certainly one way to seem cavalier, but I also put it in there as a reminder to myself of work that I want to do, because I think that there are a couple of avenues that, with the benefit of some more wide-ranging thinking about migration and attention to the racial dynamics of migration in particular, open up and become generative for Roman historians in the 4th, 3rd, and 2nd centuries. With Nick Tornato's book, one concern I had was that at the end of the day, the compact that secures Roman success is on, in his view, mainly sorted out by elites shuffling around from point A to point B to point C, sort of trying to identify which city-state or which sort of political vehicle, I mean, it does not necessarily have to be a city-state, is most advantageous to the furtherance of their sort of individual, familial, or gentilitional interests. I couldn't sort of come on board with this idea for several reasons. One of the major ones being that we have to think of many more people being involved than just these elites on the move. And attempting to model this in the book gave me the sort of like better, albeit still rather impressionistic grasp of some of the scales involved. Folks working on Roman demography and Italian demography are sort of well attuned to these, as of right now, somewhat inconclusive debates about numbers in the city and outside of the city, although archaeological work is really clarifying the picture for us. What I wanted to invest more time and attention in was a visualization of Italian culture and of Western Mediterranean culture that was much more exactingly attuned to the hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people on the move during the 4th, 3rd, and early 2nd centuries. Some of these people are moving around directly as a consequence of warfare, and there's plenty of it, as we know for this period. In connection with warfare is the phenomenon core to one of the chapters that I discuss at some length, mass enslavement and its rise in the 3rd century and its dramatic ramping up in the 2nd century. And as part of the work of examining how these flows and the literal trafficking of human beings is interacting with the formation of the Roman state, I thought it important to flag for readers just some of the opportunities available for us to think comparatively and to locate in other periods and traditions of historical inquiry some resources for better grounding our study of the Republican period. But that's all to say that I want to think more about this. And I want to think more about it, especially as it bears on religious practices. Some of the work that I summarized in the book, but that had been sort of fleshed out more fully in the 2017 article, had tried to read with the help of approaches and texts from the period of the transatlantic slave trades and from the early modern Caribbean specifically, some of the dynamics of religious transformation that unfold in connection with mass enslavement. And these, I think, would be really, really important to continue refining and elaborating for scholars of all stripes. So that's the next challenge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's actually, again, what I wanted to tease out a bit more, because of course, across this book, you take care to highlight the presence of enslaved individuals within the Roman religious ecosystem, as you call it, from the fact that it's the very enslavement of these people in a kind of liquefied form into capital that allows much of the building that you're talking about. And then also to look at their subject experiences as dramatized on the Roman stage, at least through the various kind of remnants that have been left of it. Do you, as you've been writing about it, I mean, you often write about how the system of status at Rome kind of eliminates slaves from its own kind of legitimizing structure. But have you thought about, you know, what do you think religious experience was like for slaves at Rome during this period?
I've been trying to give this question some thought, but I run into some walls, and I should sort of attempt to spell some of those out. So when I was working on the 2017 article I referenced a moment ago, my motivation for working that up stemmed in part from a desire to read and engage more carefully the writings of one of my favorite Roman authors, Plautus. And so now in volunteering a name and an author, I also go some of the way towards answering a question that's come up from my colleague Dan Garver in philosophy about the kinds of evidence available to us. For the writings of Plautus, we have the terrific work of Amy Richland and others, and one of my panelists here to give us an idea of how plays, in particular, speak to, evaluate, crystallize enslavement in the social dynamics of enslavement. But of course, this is a corpus of evidence that has limits. And what I thought it important to do in connection with the book was sketch how, in looking at this evidence and looking at other evidence, especially from the late 3rd and early 2nd century that's literary in nature, we can sort of build up to one component of what is, a very tessellated mosaic of religious practices in the period, religious practices that are all being redefined by the social convulsions of mass enslavement in ways small and large, in ways subtle and not so subtle. But here is where I think some of the most creative work has been done by folks who are willing to take the material archaeological evidence on board and just sort of imagine possibilities with it. So earlier you had referenced my acute interest in anatomical terracotta votives, these body part shaped dedications that really do begin to spring up in formidable numbers across central Italy and in other parts of Italy as well, and that over the course of the 4th, 3rd, and 2nd centuries become one of the major signals of a very distinct kind of religious observance. So for me, as I began studying these votives, one question was, what, if anything, can we say about the relationship between religious practice and social status. Is this a relationship for which thinking about the transformation, the great transformation of Roman society wrought by mass enslavement, does this have purchase for our understanding of that transformation? I think the answer is yes. I also think that theorizing this properly requires a great deal of care, because the last thing I would want to do is perform this kind of ventriloquism that actually speaks more to the interests of Roman elites and to the practices of domination around which they organize the performance of religious praxis than it does to the lived experiences of those who are not elites. And so there too, I think that there are exciting opportunities being opened up by really two generations of Roman scholars on religion. The work of folks like Celia Schultz on religion and gender in the Middle Republic was so crucial for me at an early stage in the project, and has continued to inform how I sort of revisit these sort of sites of cultural formation in the 4th, 3rd, and early 2nd centuries. But we are faced here with evidentiary challenges that require spelling out, right? Like one of the efforts of the book was to show that we actually have a lot of evidence, but at the same time that we say there's much more evidence than scholars have admitted to be true for the 4th and 3rd centuries. We also have to be sort of frank about what it is that we can and can't do with the evidence, and what it is about that evidence that would seem to stupefy even the sort of most versatile interpreter of these experiential realities.
So with the nature of the evidence, one of the things that I love about your book is that you give color plates to your data visualization, and I'm so happy that Princeton University Press agreed that color was necessary for this data visualization. Can you talk to us about some of the choices you made in what sorts of data needed to be, what sorts of questions were good to visualize, and what aha moments you got out of playing around with data visualization?
Mm-hmm. So when I was a graduate student at Stanford, because of the setup of the ancient history PhD, we were encouraged to take classes, many classes outside of the classics department. And one of the departments to which I ended up gravitating was sociology. Sociology was offering a social network analysis course, and I took that course when I was still in coursework, and I thought to myself, this is a terrific asset. This is really helpful for trying to evoke and present in a compelling way some of the dynamics that otherwise would be reduced to tables and numbers in the pages of the dissertation. So, straight away I thought of, trying to work social network analysis into the project and finding some ways, however imperfect, of sort of building up its prominence in the analysis and exposition of analysis that I saw as important for the later chapters of the project. And in PUP, I found the press that was willing to support me in this. So I got to shout out Rob Tempio, who has been great, and the entire team, Matt Rohal, production folks at PUP, for agreeing with me on the importance of visualization and on the need for color. Do I think that they're the world's best SNA maps? No. Do I think that they have limitations? Yes. Do I think that given more opportunities, I would have redone them all? Absolutely. I was sorely tempted to redo everything in the final stages. But what I think is useful about the visualizations is less their sort of crystalline performance of a kind of interdisciplinarity. Here's the scholar who does SNA. Then their willingness to communicate just how varied the approaches are that will be needed to do proper justice to the scope of the Middle Republic's cultural transformation. So I'm not gonna knock lit people here, especially since I am in the company of folks who are deeply committed to lit work too. But I think it is important, especially for students and just general audiences interested in Roman history, to leave them with an understanding of Roman history that is not monopolized by the form and format of text, qua text. There are, to go back to one of our earlier threads of conversation, there are so many bodies of evidence, and there are so many ways of centering and clarifying the import of that evidence. And especially for folks who might have flavoring their historical interests or their literary critical interests, some social scientific interests. I'm like, here is a way of according, legitimacy and primacy to this interest in a way that doesn't simply subordinate that interest to a form of academic discourse that can be quite monopolizing, especially for historians who are trained in textual interpretation, which, to be very honest, was like a core part of my training as a Roman historian.
I think at this point we want to echo what the host has said, is that we have still time for some questions. So if you want to ask a question, put it in the ask a question bit at the bottom of your screen. While you're thinking about that, let me ask another. By the way, this last point, this is not a question, but just rather the dreaded comment, but I think that the narrativity that you're describing, like the resistance of falling into narrativity of our ancient sources, is one of the things that's really refreshing about your book, because you basically say, well, what if we look at all these other things that deeply resist narrativity, like fragments often do, because they're so challenging. But anyway, here's a question, which is that I was really struck by, early on in the book, the exploration of, this is really like taking a turn away from what we're discussing, but the aristocratic control of public goods, for example, the water supply, and the connection between that and religion and religiosity. And it made me think of, speaking of literature, Cicero in the De Natura Deorum in book 2, when he lays out the Stoic view of the gods, he says, the gods exist, and they govern the world, and also the evidence of their existence is that they care for human affairs. And it really made me wonder whether, you can look at everything that happens politically during this time as kind of masculine posturing and it's paternalistic, and that's all true. But is also care a constitutive element of religious feeling? You call temples objects of care, but are they also sites of care that emblematize and manifest kind of divine care? And does trust in gods ultimately mean trust in human support?
Yeah, this is a great question. I want to think more about it and what it means for some of the ground clearing that I've attempted to do in the book, because I feel you're absolutely right to cite this passage from the De Natura Deorum as exemplifying a perspective not just sort of stoically infused, but I think also sort of like organically resonant with Roman mentalities from earlier periods, in which the care of the gods for human beings is prominent and accentuated. I think one of the aspects of the book that I would for sure have redone is its sort of minimal attention to questions of affect, because I think affect is a good way for entering into a conversation about responses to the perception of care. So I think there's this sort of range and spectrum of affects that prove definitive for the history of Roman religious observance in the 4th, 3rd, and early 2nd centuries. Some of those affects have been well and profitably plumbed. So, something like fear, for example, has gotten a lot of attention. With J. Rufus Fear's writing on the theology of fear, and Anna Clark's writing on abstract and divine qualities. There's been attention to some of these abstractions and how the worship of abstraction is sort of tinged with aspects that one could sort of psychologize or psychoanalyze. But I'm also thinking of other affects too. Intimacy. Someone like a Scipio Africanus going to the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus and just spending time there. This could be just like a story that we tell, that our sources told about Scipio Africanus, the victor over Hannibal, and his exemplarity, and specifically his religious exemplarity. But I see it as saying something much more interesting and intriguing about some of the personal dispositions that are being cultivated in response to the perception that the gods care and the gods are interested. But there's another side to this, and there's one. It's one that's, I think, been brought out best in work on Nivias's Bellum Punicum. So clearly, in the course of the First Punic War and its aftermath, and continuing into the years of the Second Punic War, there is a kind of, for lack of a better adjective, theological transformation underway. And one of the aspects of this transformation that I feel sort of needs even sort of more critical momentum for its explanation, but for which the work of my colleague Dennis Feeney, but and Tom Bates and others has been so helpful, is in how particular forms of literary production become sites for the staging of a new relationship between Rome and the gods, a relationship in which the gods really do care for the Roman state, and they're so committed to the Roman state that now we get to the aftermath of the Second Punic War and the boast of Marcus Valerius Masala and that letter to the citizens of Teos, that the fruits of their concern are everywhere evident in the successes that the state has enjoyed. And this is, I describe it in the book as a kind of sort of swaggering proposition on the part of this Roman magistrate, but I maybe should credit it with more than that. For a community that faced what it faced in the Second Punic War and came out at the end as victorious, at least for some members of the elite, there would have been this overriding validation of the proposition that the gods did care for them, because they came out and they survived what for them was the sort of generationally ground-shaking challenge to the security of their society. And some of them, unsurprisingly, like Marcus Valerius Masala, or even someone like Cato the Elder, are committed to this idea that really, at the end of the day, this means that we are awesome. And this is a profoundly chauvinistic view. But it is one that I believe receives a great deal of substantiation from a commitment to religious identity that is centered on the idea that the gods care and love us. So that's my answer to your question, which I admit I need to think a lot more about.
No, I really think it's important to say that it's paternalistic, but they believe in what the show of the paternalism is asking, So Lee, do you want to, should we move over to some questions? We have one question in the chat. I don't want to cut you off in case you wanted to ask something else. So
that is fine. We will continue our conversation another chance. We should bring in more voices. So Dan Garber asks, and this is particularly for those outside the field. He'd like a broad answer. What kind of evidence did you use to reconstruct the religious attitudes and practices that you discuss in the book?
So several kinds of evidence, some literary and some not literary. Normally, the history of Roman religious practice is reconstructed by reference to sources that are writing in the 1st century BC and later. And what I decided to do was to limit myself and not use these sources nearly to the extent that they've been used in the past, to focus instead on some of our evidence from the 3rd century BC in particular. The problem here is, though, that Roman literary production begins fairly late, to paraphrase several colleagues who may be in attendance. And as a result, there is not that much written by Roman authors that survives for us intact. Much of it survives in fragments, the specialty of one of my esteemed interlocutors. But we also have abundant archaeological evidence and material evidence of many different sorts, from the remains of the temples at the heart of my book. Not that many of them survive, but there are a few. To votive dedications deposited at temples, not just in Rome, but elsewhere in Italy, many of which are uninscribed, a few of which aren't inscribed, with texts that tell us a little bit about the people responsible for dedicating them. And then to turn back to one of my favorite bodies of material evidence, we have these little cups or vases that are inscribed with the names of deities in the genitive, one of which is in the possession of Princeton University's Art Museum. So when the Art Museum eventually reopens and you are in the Princeton area, you can take a look at it. So these are just the sort of cornerstones of evidence for the project. There are a few other bodies of evidence I cite, but that's the beating heart of it.
The Pacala appendix is just so yummy. Like, I can spend all day reading that and looking at, anyways. It's definitely one of my favorite parts of the book.
Great, let's get another question from the chat. What kind of economic benefit did the state and or individual merchants realize with the proliferation of these public rituals and celebrations?
When I was working on the dissertation that became this book, I thought that I was going to spend a lot more time answering this question, because originally the project in its prospectus form had been pitched as one concerned in part with questions of economic change at Rome. And as part of some of the early work I was doing, I was becoming more and more concerned with nailing down, if only in a very rough sense, some of the economic transactions that will have unfolded, in the immediate vicinity of temples, and that sort of intersected with ritual observance and festivals. Before deciding that this needed to be the focus of like a separate and like sort of much more substantial study, even though this gets some play in the book, one of the hesitations I had was that I was trained in a sort of new institutional economics framework that spends a great deal of time thinking about things like transaction costs, and I had done some writing to sort of lay out my own sense of how collective religious activity helps lower transaction costs, especially among people who don't know each other. But then I began to feel less confident in some of this. And then I decided I couldn't really do this line of interpretation justice. So to answer the question directly, I think that there are clear economic benefits that are being realized by the state and by individual merchants during this period. And I think that for folks who want to sort of build out some of the models, especially in chapter 5, there is at least a foundation for devising a scheme for mid-Republican commercial activity in the city, in the vicinity of temples, that can help provide a more concrete answer to this question. But I moved away from this question in the formulation of the project in its final form. And I think that reflects more than anything a shift in my own wavering commitments to the economic modes of interpretation that would have been central to answering this question properly.
so we have another question in the chat. The book argues towards the end of the introduction that Roman identity is not only informed by religion, understood as a single thing, but is formed by group-forming religious technologies. Does this concern with the technological nature of social formations emerge from your parallel thinking about race and its technological attributes? And what else might that conversation yield ought we to understand other human constructions like race in terms of trust, ritual, and construction?
So I want to give a shout out to Justin, one of the stars of the Race and Humanities seminar that my colleague Tom Davies and I co-taught this semester. And thanks, Justin, for this question. The short answer is absolutely. I think that one of the benefits of approaching religion as having technological properties is that it enables us to open a space for relating the workings of religion to the workings of race and race making in the Roman world. And that is something that is animating some of my current thinking as I prepare to write at some point in the near future a chapter on race in the Roman world for one of the myriad Cambridge companions. These continue to multiply like the cicadas all over Princeton. The other sort of dimension to the question that I want to sit with for a while longer is whether we are dealing with a process of analogy. Is religion in sort of technological infrastructure akin to race and its technological infrastructure in the Roman Mediterranean, or are we dealing with a sort of coterminous and possibly even sort of convergent process? Are we seeing in the religious transformation of the Middle and Late Republic a space for the articulation of new concepts of identity that are at their core racial in nature? And my early answer to this is yes, we are seeing this. But it's important to carry out this analysis in ways that doesn't simply reify some of the early 20th century arguments by people like Tenny Frank and others, according to which what happens in the Republican Empire is just a steady infusion of foreign elements with their religious and other ethnic identifying practices that collectively contribute, in their view, to the debasing of the Roman race, right? So I am very, very cautious about making sure that in developing a mode of analysis that bridges religious studies and the work being done in Roman religious studies and race making, that I take lessons from folks who have done this work expertly in early Christian studies, in biblical hermeneutics, for example, and that I not fall into the trap of simply looking into the self-contained reservoir of myopic perspectives that is Roman Republican history of a fairly traditional stripe in developing my tools of analysis. But Justin has pointed the way to where some of this work goes next. So for Justin's question, I'm grateful.
Do you think we have time for one more question? The gods have not intervened, so I'm going to ask it. This is from Rosanna. How were the small cups and the names of the deity inscribed? How did this inform your conclusions, and how was this information fused with other sources?
Now, thanks for this question, Rosanna. The cups have names of divinities that receive cult at Rome, and in some cases, there's a very strong argument to be made that the divinities are linkable to cults that receive a temple at Rome in the late 4th or first half of the 3rd century BCE. On the basis of that association, I moved to making an argument. You're going to hear some children screaming in the background because it is sleep time in this house. On the basis of that association, I tried to build out, using other bodies of evidence as well, to an argument about pilgrimage networks and about mobility. Because for me, the most interesting aspect of these cups inscribed with the names of deities, many of whom received cultic Rome, is that they're not found in Rome. Many of them are found elsewhere in central Italy, usually on or in close proximity to road networks that link Rome to other parts of central and northern Italy. So that's the nature of the argument, but it is one whose integrity depends less on individual popula or cups and more on a kind of ecosystem argument. If you look at the plurality of the evidence and what it might point to, you can derive a set of conclusions that explain the relationship of these particular cups to pilgrimage operations and networks more generally.
So, one of the surprises for me of this year has been the fact that there are people who can take a virtual event and make us feel like we're sitting around a table together, the three of you among them. So thank you for bringing that sort of connected, intimate spirit to this conversation. I think, Danielle, what I appreciate especially in how you talk about your book is that you give us the sense that every book remains unfinished, and that going to press is an arbitrary moment, and we keep thinking about the questions, and they keep evolving in dialogue. And I think all of you are making these generous gestures towards each other's work, towards work of lots of others in the wider circle, and that's just such a nice example of really the spirit of scholarship and at its best. So thank you for that. Thank you for spending time with us. Thank you to everyone who has tuned in. I'm going to hold up the book one more time. Let's all hold up the book one more time. It's get your copy. If you're not in Princeton and you have an independent bookstore that you love, get it there. If you don't, just go online at Labyrinth. And so I encourage you to stay connected with us and to check back with us. You can sign up for our events announcement by going to our website or just on this platform. And again, I'm not sure what form events will take in the fall. I expect it's going to be a mix, because we have found that while I miss seeing everybody, and I think there's something that we get from being in a room together that we just can't reproduce, at the same time, there's a way of being far-flung and together that this medium has allowed, and so maybe we'll hang on to a piece of that. But for now, Danielle, you got kids waiting for you, and so do you, Leaf, and maybe, I don't know if you do, Hannah. So I will release you into your evening and wish all of you a good night and good health. So take care, everybody.
Take care, folks.
Bye-bye.
And please buy Leave's book on the Roman Republic to 49 BC, using coins as sources. And when it comes out, from Cambridge, Cicero and the Early Latin Poets. Get your copies.
Thank you, Danielle.
Amen to that. Good. I always love a good book plug. All right. Bye, y'all.